This morning, I went out to Okmulgee, to the mountains out there, and I was enjoying walking the trails. And it's a wonderful place to walk, especially in the morning. You can hear the leaves rustling, you can see bluebirds. I saw a bluebird. You can take a break from the busyness of Macon and the sound of the traffic. And I felt that way too, because Tuesday evening, I also looked outside and saw the snow. And as somebody who grew up in Pittsburgh, who spent some time living in Winnipeg, I was like, let's do it. We are gonna walk in the snow. And so I did. And I had forgotten, because it's been so long since I've walked in the snow, that it is quiet, because the snow dampens sound. It kind of taps it all down, and there's no ability for the sound waves to travel. And between the quiet of Tuesday night and maybe my search for spring this morning, I realized just how powerful of a thing it is to take a walk and enjoy nature. It reminded me of the Hasidic saying, Ein od milvado, there is nothing other than God. Last week, many of us watched in great sadness, as I'm sure some of us have friends and family in Southern California, and witnessed that power of nature once again. This time, not for the quietness and the connectivity that I found earlier this week, but for the awesome powerfulness of what a tornado in the air looks like, of burning embers, and knowing that that's somebody's old home, and knowing that a community is now wiped out. And all of this, of course, got me thinking about weather conditions, about nature, and in this week especially, about the plagues in Egypt, where you got to see nature having another moment, as it were. This week's portion specifically describes how Pharaoh's heart itself was hardened in response to the sheer brutality of God. And if you think those plagues were, just a little bit of fun Hollywood sizzle-zazzle, I want you to really think about how painful it must have been when the water that the Egyptians drank turned to blood, when insects were swarming, when there were piles of dead livestock, and the stench you can kind of imagine emanating. But beyond focusing on that part of it, which I think historically I almost always have, there were two verses almost toward the end of the plagues that I've usually, to be truthful, I've overlooked and didn't notice it until this year. Quote, now the flax and barley were ruined, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud, but the wheat and spelt were not hurt, for they ripened late. And I didn't really kind of think about what these mean. So I had to go into the commentaries. I had to look at what Ibn Ezra, a 12th century Spanish scholar and grammarian, said, and Ramban, a 13th century physician and mystic, or Chaim, an 18th Moroccan sage. I tried to, spice it up with different people from different locations and different times. And I even looked at Everett Fox's translation of the text itself. In these two brief verses, what we find in great detail that the commentators did in fact wrestle with for generations was, what does it mean that the flax and the barley are gone, but the wheat and spelt are okay? Ibn Ezra, being the grammarian that he was, focused on the word afilot, describing it as a late ripening crops. And it shares its roots with afel, darkness, so that the wheat and the spelt survived because they were still underground in the darkness. They hadn't popped up. There were no bright buds blooming. And he went on to note what a profound metaphor that is about protection and vulnerability and looking at what remains. Rambam saw it as Moses' subtle warning to Pharaoh to give up and allow the Israelites to go. Look, the staple crop is spared, Pharaoh, but it's God's choice. God expressed power by sparing that crop. The destruction of the flax and the barley serve as a warning and a gift of mercy. And last summer, I'll share with you just something that kind of drove the point home when I was thinking about this. I had decided that I was going to do a garden in pots on my back porch, thinking that's brilliant. It's easy. I don't have to go into into the ground quite as much. No, it wasn't brilliant, because it turns out when you have pots on a porch in Georgia where the sun shines in the afternoon, even though you're trying to water it diligently, you've baked the roots, which I did, and of course decided to interpret it as some cataclysmic error in my thinking and that I have a black thumb. The kids reinforced that idea with me too, not to worry. Or Chaim, though, perhaps suggested the most psychologically astute reading of the text. He suggested that the self-destruction, or the selective destruction, was intentionally designed as a miracle within a miracle. A miracle within a miracle. The very fact that some survived and others perished led Pharaoh and his advisors to doubt God's total authority. They interpreted the mercy of the restraint as a weakness. How often do we misread signs? Like I said, my thought of the potted garden was, I can still plant, I can still make things grow. I have another season to have at it. My herb garden will come back. It'll be epic. But we often will misinterpret things for the worst, or how we want to see it, instead of seeing it as the opportunity, the possibility, the miracle within the miracle. When I walked through the snow-hushed streets of Macon this past week, when I heard the birds singing so beautifully this morning in the Okmulgee Mounds, as I watched the terrible, destructive California fires last week, we witnessed the same truth too, or I witnessed it as well, that nature itself is simply an expression of divine will. Sometimes that will manifests as destruction, sometimes it manifests as preservation. Sometimes it speaks in thunderous voices, and sometimes in silence. The miracle of the crops reminds us that divine power operates with precision. Not every plague struck its target, not every crop was destroyed, and not every moment is filled with darkness. There is wisdom in the selectivity, even if we, like Pharaoh, sometimes misread it. Even in the midst of devastation, there are pockets of preservation. And maybe that is simply what it looks like, a warning of what we should be able to accomplish. Ein od milvado, there is none other than God, in the quiet of the snow, in the song of the birds, in the fury of fire, in the selective destruction of crops. All of it speaks to a divine presence that permeates our world. Our task is to learn to read those signs with wisdom rather than hubris, with humility rather than to harden our hearts. Let's be like the wheat and the spelt, knowing when to remain in our protective darkness, and also knowing that with the right moment, we can emerge into the light. Let's learn from Pharaoh's mistakes of seeing divine restraint as weakness rather than mercy. And let us remember that even in moments of apparent destruction, there may be purpose and protection we cannot yet see. Shabbat Shalom.